Welcome to Right from the Author from Park Place in Warren, Michigan. I'm Joe Cochran, and my guest this time is John Jafar. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe.
We're going to talk about his book, Motown Burning. It's from the late 60s, and we'll talk all the way through his life to now. The wrestling coach at Chippewa Valley has a great book. He's also wrote some poetry. We'll be right back from Right from the Author.
Hi, how are you doing today?
What looks good?
Our special today is shrimp scampi. It's been sitting around for about a week.
Excuse me, what time are you guys leaving? We're gonna rob your house tonight.
Don't you wish there were warnings to protect you from life's risks? With diabetes, there is one. It's called A1C, a simple blood test that helps measure your risk of a heart attack and other complications. Learn more at diabetes1c.org.
Welcome back to Park Place. We are doing a show called Right from the Author, and we have John here from Chippewa Valley. John, talk about your book, Motown Burning, because when you first see the name Motown Burning, you start thinking about the late 60s and way, but there's more to this book than just Motown Burning. What inspired you to do this book?
Well, I've always been fascinated by Detroit, the city's history, the events. I grew up in Dearborn myself, and have been ingrained in Tiger history and boxing history and everything about the city. And for me, that time period was kind of it's almost emblematic of the country's history. There was so many social, political, artistic tensions at that time. And in Detroit, everything came to a head for those 4 days of the Detroit Riots. And our history, to me, is kind of the history of the country at that time. There's no city that better illustrates that than the city of Detroit and those events of 1967 and the aftermath as well. And as many people have said, the city still hasn't recovered fully from that destruction.
Over 40 years ago.
Yeah.
July 23rd through July 27th, 1967. And you talked about sports, and you're a wrestling coach. The Tigers were in the middle of a pennant race. They ended up losing out by 1 game to the Red Sox that year. But you know, you're a sports fan. You were quite young at that time. You and I are roughly in that same age bracket. Your dad was working at the Olympia. My father worked in Detroit, was driving a truck for Chrysler. The tensions were high. You had the Vietnam War almost at its height. The next year, you lose Martin Luther King and you lose Bobby Kennedy. But before all that, 67, the country's being torn apart by the war. You and I are youngsters. All this is going on, and then all of a sudden, a riot breaks out. Total bedlam, and obviously your father's working down there. A lot of fear for a kid.
Absolutely. As a little kid, you really don't understand what the adults are doing or what the idea of, there was a curfew that went on, and everybody had to be inside. I lived in Dearborn, and the Mayor Orville Hubbard had the National Guard come in, and as a little kid, you see these troop movers and Army men and things like that, and it's surreal. It's what you see on TV, and I try to when I teach, I tell kids today, you see scenes of Baghdad and you see Fallujah and these places of destruction. That was 20 minutes away in 1967, and the number of casualties that occurred in that time period. Baghdad's got nothing on Detroit at that time.
I was at 9 and Shaner. I remember the helicopters going overhead,
Right.
And, the curfews. I can remember being in. The sun was still, had to be in the yard. It was a very tense moment. But your father, you said he worked at Olympia. Obviously, he was a big sports fan. He was doing security there, probably for the Red Wings and concerts and what have you. Talk about what was going through his mind. What did he share with you with what he saw?
Well, I think for him, being just a working class guy, he worked at Ford Motor Company, just like basically everybody at that time. And then he shifted over to the Olympia. And, he had to go right down Grand River to get to the stadium. And it was, I don't think something really he understood. I mean, he knew the racial tensions, the economic tensions, the social tensions that were going on. And it was a part of what he lived with, and I think when you live with that, you kind of accept it, and it's just a part of your life. But then, when that riot hits, then it really, you have to wake up to it, and you have to see it. And I think that happened for him, because as a little kid, you ask a lot of questions. Number one question, why? Why did that happen? And who's fighting whom, and it was a war of all against all. I mean, you really couldn't pick out who the enemy was or who your friends were either. I mean, it was like you say, pure bedlam.
Any responses on your book? Anybody who's read it? What have you heard from people? This is, a book that's full of a lot of stuff. It had to taken you a while to accumulate all this because it was that late '60s to early '70s was quite a time period.
What I like and what's heartening to me is kind of your reaction. That is, you remember where you were in those riots, and the first thing people come up to me is they say, when we got news of it, I was standing here, whether it was 9 Mile and Shana or wherever it was, or this is what happened to my family. They immediately open up and start telling their stories. And it's like, for every generation, you kind of, where were you when John F. Kennedy was killed? And everybody can tell you right where they were, and they know that story. And that's what happens with this book, is that someone will immediately start to open up. And in some way, I almost want to capture all those other stories too, because I think those could fit into the book as well. But there's countless stories out there, and everybody's got one.
And then getting into Vietnam, my dad was a World War II hero, and I'm sure that you have some people who, won one of the wars, or North Korea, World War II, what have you. At that point, a lot of people who were getting in trouble, you didn't realize if you were in serious trouble. I read in your book some great chapters in here. A lot of people who were either offered jail time or offered a chance to go serve in the military and go to Vietnam. Talk about some of those people you knew, because that was the offer. You got jail time or you're going to Nam.
Yeah, that actually did happen. That's a part of the background of the story. I taught in a prison for 3 years at the Allen Correctional Institute down in Ohio. And some of my students there, they would get very personal in their writing. And I had a number of Vietnam vets who would come back from the war with some issues, with some troubles, a lot of times addiction and the like, and they end up in prison. And the one guy told me of getting into trouble. He was arrested for assault, and he was given the option at the time, either you join the Marines or you're going to go to prison. He thought, well, if I go to Vietnam and join the Marines, maybe I'll just be stuck behind a desk, or I won't be in combat. So it seemed like a good idea to him, a good option. He took that. Now, when he got over there, he was put into combat, and that's kind of what happens to the kid in the book as well.
The book is Motown Burning. John, there's a couple chapters in there. One is called Opie and Saint. Could you explain those a little bit to me? I read those.
Yeah, each one of the chapters is narrated by a different character in the story. The one thread that remains consistent is the character of AP, Aram Pehlivanian, the protagonist in the book. But the narrative point of view shifts from chapter to chapter. So Opie is a soldier in Vietnam. He narrates one chapter, but he talks about AP, and they call him Motown because he's from Detroit. So he'll talk about some experiences with Motown. Then Saint, who is Motown or AP's best friend, he narrates another chapter. And slowly, you follow the kid's story, but it's never from the same point of view, and it kind of the narrative technique is to be constantly shifting from chapter to chapter.
And I noticed in some of the chapters you have like the MC5. You quote stuff from their music.
Yeah.
The Temptations, Ball of Confusion, 1968.
Yes.
But it seems like you go to the MC5 and a lot of the Motown, obviously Motown Burning singers. Talk about how they inspired you for this book.
That's gigantic. Like I said, my father, he worked with those people down at the Olympia. He did shows with, major international acts. He did the Stones, and he did Elvis. He did Led Zeppelin.
Never heard of them.
Oh yeah, some of these bands. I think they're all coming back with albums. But he worked with them. But he worked a lot with the younger Detroit-based groups, the MC5, Iggy Pop.
Iggy Pop is mentioned in your book.
Bob Seger. He knew all of these guys, and that music is so, to me, alive even today. It doesn't get old.
It's like that era defined that music, but those musicians and that music defined that era. It's almost like just a crossover.